To descend into the unyielding, high-pressure furnace of a natal Saturn-opposition-Mars alignment is to confront a psyche engineered for permanent structural warfare, absolute muscle-to-bone friction, and the grueling crystallization of personal willpower. In this architectural standoff, Mars, the primordial engine of raw kinetic drive, adversarial ambition, sexual heat, and immediate physical execution, stands locked in a direct, 180-degree collision course with Saturn, the cosmic titan of absolute boundary containment, systemic restriction, chronological delay, and institutional authority. The native does not experience their inner drive as a flowing, effortless current. Instead, they experience existence as a permanent state of psychological and energetic gridlock, where every instinctual impulse to push forward, assert the self, or launch a desire is instantly met by an invisible, impenetrable concrete wall of internal or external negation. The mechanism of the paralyzed engine. This permanent structural polarization breeds a highly specialized behavioral pathology defined as the defensive immobilization of desire. Because the native's central nervous system carries a baseline, subconscious terror of being crushed, humiliated, or violently punished by authority figures whenever they express raw aggression or individual desire, the conscious ego develops an acute, hypervigilant inhibition mechanism. The individual operates under the unconscious conviction that to initiate action spontaneously or to state an ambition nakedly is to court immediate destruction or catastrophic failure. Consequently, they project their internal Saturnian judge onto the external environment, viewing supervisors, institutions, intimate partners, and societal structures as predatory wardens waiting to bottleneck their progress. This transforms their active life into a grueling cycle of erratic, high-pressure stalls. The compression. The native generates an immense amount of Martian desire or ambition, but instantly bottles it up under a mountain of Saturnian self-auditing, doubt, and perfectionistic delay. The gridlock. They oscillate violently between periods of hyperdisciplined, exhausting overwork and sudden, paralyzed bouts of deep procrastination, feeling entirely trapped by their own rigid standards. The eruption. When the internal pressure becomes completely toxic and uncontainable, the Martian fire breaks through the Saturnian dam in a sudden, volatile explosion of cold rage, bitter resentment, or self-sabotaging defiance, only for the Saturnian warden to clamp down even harder in the aftermath. The ancestral labor contract. On an ancestral and genetic level, this opposition indicates a foundational inheritance of severe generational suppression, grueling physical or economic survival, and the absolute punishment of individual will within the lineage. The individual inherits a cellular matrix heavily saturated by the unresolved exhaustion and bitter resignation of ancestors who were forced into hard, joyless labor, who had their deepest passions systematically crushed by systemic oppression, war, or dictatorial patriarchs, or who had to sacrifice their personal autonomy entirely to maintain familial security. This lineage passes down an unyielding survival script dictating that life is a relentless uphill battle, that assertion invites immediate danger, and that to survive, you must put your head down, suppress your anger, weld your jaw shut, and carry the heavy millstone of duty without complaint. Physically, holding this continuous, atomic friction places an immense, exhausting strain on the native's structural frame, muscular system, and energetic reserves. Mars rules the blood, the muscles, acute inflammatory responses, and kinetic output, while Saturn rules the bones, the teeth, the joints, the skin, and the structural boundaries of organs. When locked in a zero-sum opposition, the physical body becomes a theater of chronic energetic containment. The native lives in a state of permanent somatic armoring, unconsciously locking massive amounts of survival tension, withheld rage, and thwarted drive directly into their musculoskeletal alignment. This manifests over time as chronic structural rigidity, severe lower back compaction, joint inflammation, dental degradation, and deep parasympathetic burnout that flares up overnight whenever their personal ambition faces an institutional or relational bottleneck. Ultimate strategic sovereignty. The ultimate evolutionary liberation for the Saturn-opposition-Mars native requires a radical, terrifying act of energetic surrender. They must learn the supreme courage of staying in the fire of their own frustration without converting it into bitter resentment or paralyzed defeat. The agonizing, repeating cycle of intense ambition followed by sudden systemic shutdowns. To go deeper into the unyielding, high-pressure crucible of the Saturn-opposition-Mars matrix is to expose a psychological apparatus driven by an absolute baseline of castration anxiety. For this native, the subjective experience of desire, assertion, and initiative is never an innocent or spontaneous flow of kinetic energy, it is an immediate confrontation with the law. The psyche operates under an ambient, low-grade conviction that any raw movement of personal willpower or self-assertion is fundamentally illegal and will be met with swift, crushing retribution from the environment. The individual does not simply want, they check their desires for systemic safety, treating every instinctual impulse to compete, dominate, or create as a potential violation of an invisible, cosmic penal code. They live with a nervous system that is chronically gridlocked, as the ego structure perpetually drives the foot onto the gas pedal of Martian ambition while simultaneously slamming the Saturnian brake down to the floorboards, generating an internal friction so intense that it threatens to burn out the psychic engine entirely. This permanent state of internal siege gives rise to a highly destructive, specialized behavioral pathology that can be defined as the defensive cultivation of structural bottlenecks. Because the native's baseline wiring cannot safely tolerate the raw, terrifying vulnerability of open competition or unchecked success, which triggers a subconscious fear of total exposure and subsequent punishment, the conscious mind develops an addiction to the safety of obstacles. If a project, career path, or personal relationship begins to move smoothly toward a successful or fulfilling resolution, an intolerable anxiety or imposter syndrome sets in. To relieve the suffocating pressure of impending visibility, the Saturn-Mars current triggers a subconscious mandate to preemptively engineer a blockage. The individual will instinctively overcomplicate simple logistical tasks, buried under a mountain of perfectionistic micromanagement and self-imposed rules until the initial creative spark is utterly choked out. They will adopt a passive-aggressive or hyper-defensive communication style with authority figures, unconsciously provoking the exact institutional resistance, rejection, or discipline that confirms their worldview. They will systematically endure toxic, restrictive environments for years, weaponizing a grim, martyr-like endurance to justify why they cannot pursue their true passions or manifest their authentic power. They would rather actively rule over a predictable, highly disciplined failure of their own design than risk the terrifying vulnerability of stepping into the unshielded arena of total self-actualization. This exhausting behavioral loop is deeply anchored in a highly specific ancestral memory script, the law of the crushing hammer. On a genetic and karmic level, this opposition indicates that the individual's physical vehicle has been engineered to function as the primary circuit breaker for a family lineage that survived through absolute submission, relentless physical labor, and the systemic burial of personal ambition. The native inherits a cellular matrix heavily saturated by the unresolved bitterness, thwarted fury, and cold resignation of ancestors who were forced into joyless, hard labor, who had their deepest creative and sexual expressions violently crushed by tyrannical patriarchs or economic oppression, or who had to sacrifice their autonomy entirely to maintain the sheer survival of the bloodline. This lineage passes down a heavy, defensive script dictating that the world is an unforgiving stone mill, that to stand out or demand more is to ask for immediate decapitation, and that those who hold power are merely waiting for an opening to break your will. When the native experiences a wave of intense, paralyzing procrastination or a sudden spike of cold, impotent rage at a minor bureaucratic delay, they are waking up the ancient survival mechanics of an entire ancestral army. And the absolute evolutionary mandate of this incarnation is to break this cycle by proving to the subconscious mind that it is entirely possible to exercise supreme individual authority without inviting destruction. Physically, holding this continuous, atomic friction places an immense, exhausting strain on the native's structural frame, muscular alignment, and cellular vitality. Mars rules the blood, the muscles, acute inflammatory responses, and kinetic energy output, while Saturn rules the bones, the teeth, the joints, the skin, and the hard structural boundaries of the organs. When these two cosmic principles collide in a tight, 180-degree opposition, the physical body behaves like an engine locked in a permanent isometric contraction. generating intense systemic heat and placing an agonizing load on the organic frame. The native lives in a state of permanent somatic armoring, unconsciously. To descend even deeper into the unyielding, high-pressure core of the Saturn-opposition-Mars alignment is to encounter a psyche locked in an ongoing state of emotional and kinetic incarceration. In this high-tension matrix, the native's instinctual, assertive nature is treated not as a natural drive for self-actualization, but as an volatile liability that must be continually policed, cross-examined, and scrubbed of any perceived impulsivity. Saturn acts as an uncompromising internal warden, continuously monitoring the Martian landscape for signs of unauthorized desire, emotional leaking, or raw aggression. The individual operates under an unwavering internal containment protocol where every ambitious longing, sexual drive, or urge to initiate an independent action is instantly intercepted and subjected to a brutal risk assessment matrix before it can reach conscious expression. They do not experience their active life as a free-flowing arena of potential, but as a heavily guarded panopticon, tightly fortified by an absolute terror of failure, public humiliation, and systemic erasure. This permanent state of internal mobilization gives rise to a highly specialized psychological defense mechanism defined as the defensive orchestration of permanent deadlocks. Because the native carries a foundational script that associates direct self-assertion with imminent destruction, they manage their personal and professional lives by translating them into complex, unwinnable endurance trials. They replace spontaneous action with unspoken power struggles and grueling tests of stamina designed to see how much institutional or relational pressure they can withstand before collapsing. They choose environments and partners that either trigger their deep fears of restriction or possess highly unyielding, rigid structures themselves, creating alliances that operate like intense, unspoken cold wars rather than warm, collaborative workspaces. They construct a psychological fortress of absolute self-reliance, calculating that if they keep their ambitions completely hidden while maintaining a flawless mask of duty and compliance, they can insulate themselves from the terrifying pain of historical invalidation. Yet, this strategy requires an immense amount of psychic and somatic energy, locking them in an exhausting state of permanent energetic gridlock, where they are deeply bitter about the lack of true, effortless success in their lives, yet utterly terrified of dropping the perfectionistic standards and hypervigilance required to let themselves simply move forward. Ultimately, the evolutionary journey of this opposition is not designed to permanently destroy the native's capacity for passion under a mountain of crushing restrictions, but to forge them into a vessel of profound, unmatched strategic mastery. The agonizing, repeating cycle of intense drive followed by sudden systemic shutdowns and catastrophic failures will never truly break until the individual undergoes a radical shift in consciousness, realizing that the cold, punishing environment they are fighting so desperately in the outside world is merely the reflection of their own internal Saturnian shadow denying them permission to achieve. True liberation occurs when they stop looking to external validation, institutional permission, or defensive overwork to justify their authority, and instead tolerate the raw vulnerability of validating their own individual will from within. When they finally dissolve this internal civil war, the Martian raw power and the Saturnian architectural master fuse into a magnificent architectural axis, becoming individuals who can look into the absolute heaviest burdens of human labor with an unblinkingly calm, majestic composure, executing monumental achievements and providing a profound, indestructible blueprint for others because they have successfully guided their own will through the absolute zero of their own psychological prison. Subscribe, like, and share.